And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, just a little bit of history about Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation. We are the primary nonprofit partner that works in partnership with Angel Island State Park to preserve the buildings at this National Historic Landmark, as well as to uplift its histories and the stories of immigrants who came through Angel Island, as well as the stories of those who are coming to the US today. And one of the things that's very important to us is having the opportunity to ensure that through the work that we do, that more people have an understanding, right, of what happened at Angel Island, because it's unfortunately not common knowledge. That because of that understanding and that memory, that remembering of the injustices, of the treatment of, in particular, Asian and Pacific Islander immigrants, that gives us a little bit of pause to continue to think about for today and for the future. How do we treat immigrants who are coming to the US, regardless of what nation they come from or what language they speak or how they identify? At the foundation, we have worked over the past 4 decades to raise almost $40 million in public and private funding to preserve these buildings as well as to uplift these histories. And this year happens to be our 40th anniversary. This program is just one of the pieces of the events that we've got planned for this coming year to celebrate this milestone. We hope that you'll be able to join us in April when we have our annual gala and Immigrant Heritage Awards for the very first time taking place on Angel Island itself. We will also be holding a family day that hopefully will be an opportunity for children, for teens, for adults, and for elders to all come together and to experience the site, to see the exhibits there, to enjoy performances and musical numbers and fun activities that give an opportunity for us all to have some dialogue about what happened then and how it's happening again, unfortunately, today now. For tonight, what we have is this Immigrant Voices Live program. And this is a program that actually evolves out of a long-standing program that the foundation has held. Our Immigrant Voices project started about a decade ago. We're actually joined by one of our former staff, Grant Den, and he and Eddie Wong had this really amazing idea to ensure that the stories of those who came through Angel Island are not lost and forgotten. And through their work, through the work of the late historian Judy Young and so many other staff, board, and volunteers, we've been able to curate over 250 stories of immigrants, those who came through Angel Island, as well as those who've come more recently. And so if you take a moment, if you're interested, to check out our website and read about some of the stories of these journeys that people have taken. One of the things I'm really excited about for tonight is that this program, Immigrant Voices Live, really builds on the past 10 years. It's an opportunity for you to hear straight from the mouths of immigrants, from folks of immigrant heritage, about what their journeys, what their families' journeys have been like here in the US. Over the course of tonight and at future story shares, you'll have the opportunity to listen to these stories that are just filled with emotion, filled with stories of how we were made to feel different, stories of how we were made to feel like we belonged. And as you listen to these stories, I hope that you take a moment to just reflect on how these stories perhaps are similar or perhaps different from the stories that you or your family might have experienced. And to think about what these stories mean, why it's so important for us to take the opportunity to share these stories, whether they're positive stories or whether they're negative stories. They are stories about our experiences, and through learning about each other's experiences, we hopefully have the opportunity to develop just a little bit more understanding and empathy for one another. So I'm joined tonight by 3 amazing storytellers. These storytellers were part of a leadership program that I helped to co-found and co-facilitate in one of my previous jobs. And so they've had the experience of going through a training to share their stories. It's very similar to a training that we're going to be offering in March with that we hope that you'll sign up for, and that after listening to tonight's program that you're inspired to think about how you might share your own story or your own family story. We'll be doing these trainings both live and virtually, with the hope that we'll be hosting both virtual story shares like tonight's in the future, as well as in-person story shares on Angel Island on the grounds of the former immigration station and detention barracks. So I have the privilege and the opportunity to kick off tonight's program by sharing one of my stories about what it was like for me as an immigrant growing up in Texas. And so just for those of you who've not met me before, a little bit of background about myself. I am of Chinese and Thai heritage. My grandparents were born in China and they immigrated to Thailand. I was born in Bangkok, Thailand, and immigrated to the US in the 1970s and grew up in Texas. And I currently serve, again, as the executive director for the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation. But one thing that you might not know about me just by looking at me is that I used to have a food blog. And so food is a key theme for the story that I'm sharing with you tonight. So one of my first memories of food is from a trip that my parents and I took when I was just a young child back to Thailand to visit our aunts and uncles and cousins and my grandparents. And I remember stepping outside of my uncle and aunt's home and seeing a street vendor with this stone platform and a grill on top of it. And there was this amazingly delicious scent that was wafting up from the street vendor. What he was making is kanom kuchai, which is translated means Thai Chinese chive cakes. And they're very similar to the Chinese chive dumplings that you might see in dim sum, but the texture of the wrapper is just a little bit different. They're a little bit thicker. In Thai culture, they are pan fried often, so they develop this extremely crispy, crunchy crust, and then you've got the nice chewy dough, and then the moist pieces of pan-fried chives in the center. And so I have such vivid memories of enjoying these kanom kuchai, these Thai fried Chinese chive cakes, when on every single trip that I went back to visit my grandparents and relatives, which was only about every 6 years. And so coming to the US after returning from these trips, I would ask my parents if I could have kanom kuchai. Unfortunately, we didn't have street vendors outside of our house in Houston, Texas, to make these chive cakes. And it's not a menu item that you often find in Thai restaurants. So my parents had to learn how to make these chive cakes so that I can enjoy them here in the US. And as an adult, after getting the recipe from my parents and also watching them as a kid making these things, I don't think I fully comprehended how involved these things are to make, because you first have to mix the dough together. You've got to mix the rice flour, the sticky rice flour, the tapioca flour, and get the measurements just right to make that perfect consistency. Then you've got to hand chop all of these chives and pan fry them. And then you've got to shape the dough into these dumplings with your hands, making a disc and then putting a scoop or two of the Chinese chives into them and then wrapping it up, then steaming them, then finally pan frying them so you get this crispy crunch on the outside. And they truly are a labor of love. As an adult now, I recognize how much my parents went through in terms of making my favorite dish for me as a kid. And I loved these Chinese chive cakes so much that I would bring them to school. And like many of you who are immigrants, you've probably had that experience of getting teased, getting food bullied for the foods that you brought to school because they didn't look like the peanut butter or jelly sandwiches that your friends brought, or the ham and cheese sandwiches, or the cardboard shaped pizzas that they served at our elementary school on those yellow trays. So, but I didn't care. I brought these Chinese chive cakes because I loved them. And the reactions from my fellow classmates, I remember they'd kind of look at me very funny because this was not like what they brought for their lunches. They definitely were very pungent. They had this very strong smell. And it kind of looked like grass, right? To those of of us as kids. And it didn't help that I didn't know that they were called Chinese chive cakes back then. I thought they were called monkey grass. And so my fellow classmates would make fun of me for eating monkey grass. And then what was different though was that there was one friend of mine, one classmate of mine who didn't make fun of me. He saw me open up my lunch sack and he kind of leaned over and he kind of like gave me the eye and he's like, "What's that?" And I thought he was going to make fun of me, but he was actually really curious. And I told him what they were. They were these fried Chinese chive cakes. And he said, "Well, can I try some?" And I thought to myself, "You want to try this? Are you sure?" And I thought he was just joking, but in reality, he was persistent. He was really curious. He wanted to try these things, but I actually didn't want to share with him that very day because I only had two of these things. So I told him, "Well, let's trade lunches tomorrow." And he said, "Okay." So then that night I went back home to my parents and I told them that Hector from my third grade class wanted to try a Chinese chive cake. So could we make extra for him so that he could try it? And so they said, "Sure, of course." And so the very next day, Hector and I traded lunches. Hector was of Mexican heritage. And so he shared his bean burrito with me. And I shared my Chinese chive cake, my Thai fried chive cake with him. And he took one bite of that. And I remember his eyes just bulging out and lighting up. And he thought this was the best thing that he'd eaten since sliced bread. So throughout the remainder of our school year in third grade, Hector and I would actually trade lunches a couple more times throughout the school year. And for me, that's also a fond memory of cultures coming together, learning about different cultures. And as I grew into adulthood, I actually developed an appreciation for some of the Thai foods that I hated as a kid. So the curries that my parents would make growing up, that because they had shrimp paste and curry powder, would just pungently smell at the house. But as an adult, I learned to love these things, and I wasn't alone. I've noticed that over the past decade or so, Chinese restaurants, Japanese restaurants, Thai restaurants, Filipino restaurants, all these different cuisines of Asia have become quite popular. And you see these restaurants proliferating all across the country. Unfortunately, what we've also seen was with the rise in popularity of Asian food, especially in the past couple of years, is that there's been a rise in anti-Asian racism and anti-Asian discrimination and hate violence. And so this all came to a head for me. I thought, why is it that people really enjoy our cuisines, but then there's still all of this anti-Asian hate and racism and xenophobia? And last year during May, Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, I had the opportunity to participate on a panel with some other Asian Pacific Islander alumni of the college I went to, Washington University in St. Louis. The title of the panel was Advocacy and Allies. And as soon as the Zoom room opened up and all the panelists were shown on the screen, what caught my eye was one of my fellow panelists, because she was wearing a t-shirt and all I could see on the top of her shirt was "Love my people." But then as she lowered her screen, I could see that what her shirt actually said was "Love my people as much as you love my people's food." And so that's the message that I hope that you take with you tonight as you think about my story, is that food has such amazing opportunities, amazing powers, especially for those of us who are of immigrant heritage. It can help us remember our homelands. It can be an entry point into making new friends and learning about new cultures. But it can also hopefully be a stepping stone in terms of that continued understanding of each other's communities so that we love each other as much as we love each other's food. Thank you. I hope that that just gives you a little bit of a snapshot of what you have in store for tonight. As you listen to our three remaining storytellers, please feel free to go ahead and use those emoticons, those reactions in the Zoom screen to show our storytellers some love. You also feel free to use our chat box, and we'll actually have an opportunity at the end of tonight to have some time for folks to open up their mics or use the chat box to share your reflections, your emotions to these stories that people have shared. So next up, I am so thrilled to have the opportunity to introduce Jackie. Jackie is of Chinese descent. She lives in Salem, Oregon, and she is actually someone who is a descendant of someone who was processed or detained at Angel Island. She's married into a Micronesian community. And one thing that she wanted you to know about her is that she used to be a DJ at a radio station. So let's give a lot of love and worth to Jackie as she shares her story. Thanks for joining us tonight, Jackie.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. And thank you, Ed, for this opportunity and space to be able to share my story and the story of my family. Shh. We don't talk about that. Shh. That's not a conversation that we have in this household or beyond this household. That is what I grew up with growing up at home. When I asked my mom questions, some of the questions I asked her had to do with family history. Some of the questions I had to ask her had to do with politics. But that was a constant thing. If I asked her the question, I had to stay at home. One of the big things that I really wanted to know was my family history. The history specifically of my mom's father. See, my grandfather, my gong, he was a paper son. And that is not something that we share openly. That is something that my mom has said for us to not talk about, that it wasn't a safe place to do so. So a lot of the questions I used to ask, like I asked him, can you tell me more about this? Like what the process was? She's like, well, I'll just tell you, but you can't tell anybody. And the few times I had talked to my grandfather about it, the most that he would say was that, it was a very harrowing process. For folks who might not know what a paper son is, a paper son is somebody who is of Chinese descent, who whatever reasons, they wanted to come to the US, but they didn't have the necessary paperwork. So they knew somebody who was either a US citizen or a naturalized citizen who would be willing to put them on paper as their son. And so my grandfather was able to do that with his granduncle, listing him as his son. And the main reason why that this was done was because my grandfather had been bullied growing up, and there were concerns about whether or not it was safe for him to be there. And because there were also opportunities for him to be able to come to the US where he could be able to finish school and be able to then also work alongside my granduncle, who now officially became my grandfather according to the paperwork, or my great-grandfather according to the paperwork. And the stories that I've heard, I've heard about the travel, how long it took for him to come here, for them to fill out the paperwork, a lot of the questions that came up from immigration. And then when he arrived, he was at Angel Island and he was detained there. And there was a lot of questions that came up in terms of, and the stories that I heard was that it was repeating the same questions on different days with different immigration officers who would ask and make sure that the answers were the same, that there was nothing different. And my grandfather told me that he was extremely fearful at that time because he didn't know if maybe he said something wrong or it sounded different than what was said, but the day before. Both him and his granduncle were asked repeatedly to report back. And you'll see a little person's head popping right now. Excuse me. That's one thing to know about me. I'm a mom, so that's also something to keep in mind too. And so the main thing that came up from those conversations was that he from what he was willing to share Like he just had to keep answering the same questions with the same answer and not deviate from it. It was even some questions like, what kind of toothbrush does he use? Or, you know, where again were you born? And where again did you travel? Where did your grandfather or now dad go to? Like all those different things, like in terms of being able to answer questions and make sure that he could actually come in. And, you know, hearing those stories, it was important to me. But at the same time, it was very frustrating because I wanted to hear more. But then I'd always get back from my mom that, shh, let's not talk about that. Or we should not talk about that. We can't be open about it. And I had shared earlier that this is now the second time and I've shared this story outside of family. It's been over 30, 40 years. And, you know, my grandfather's been gone now for almost 30 years. And I'm finally being able to tell his story in a way that makes sense. But it also is a big lesson to me, extremely big lesson, that when it comes to stories, we shouldn't be hiding it. We must be willing to be open. We must be willing to, you know, tell them, because these are stories that will die. And these are stories that will not allow us to be open with who we are and to lose that history, to lose that meaning. It's for future generations, such as this little one right here. It's for, you know, their generations to know what we've done, to know what our history is. And that's the main thing I just wanted to share within this space in terms of, you know, knowing that history. You know, one other thing I wanted to mention too is, you know, that's my grandmother's story. But I also have a story about my grandmother where also stories matter. And so in the case of my grandmother, she was born here in the US, but then she ended up going to China during before World War II. And she was there in her village when the Japanese soldiers came and invaded her village. And she shared with me, and this is something that's a little bit more open, but again, it's still a lot of shushing, where there was situations where she had to hide. When the Japanese soldiers came, she ran into the forest, and she remembers that they had a dog, and they pretty much told the dog had to go, it couldn't stay there, and so the dog would go away. But they never saw the dog again. And I just learned actually from my brother a few weeks ago that my grandmother shared another story with him that I didn't even know about. And she mentioned she had told my brother that there was another time that they were hiding. They had to hide underneath the water. And Japanese soldiers were shooting into the water, trying to see if there was anybody who had come up. And again, these are stories that I am learning now, you know, as a mom, as a granddaughter. You know, these are things that I have not knew about my family. And that is why stories like this must come out, and why it can't be held in, and why going forward, there's not going to be any more of this, shh, we're not going to talk about that. Because to me, in my household, we will talk about these things. We will share these things. And we will have an open and caring household where we can tell these stories, because these stories make a difference not only for, you know, me knowing who I am, but also for little ones like this, who will know the sacrifices and the things that our families have had to go to, our ancestors have had to go to. Thank you.
Jackie, thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing both your grandfather and your grandmother's story. As you take a pause from the storytelling, I just want to check in on you. How are you feeling?
Still a little nerve-wracking. You know, it's, again, the second time I've ever had to share this story, especially, you know, about my grandfather being a paper son. And the second part where I talked about my grandmother hiding a hide under the water. That's the first time I've pulled outside of just hearing from my brother. So it's to me, it's a powerful moment to be able to share these stories as something that my family has gone through, but also something that other people should be aware of how much our history plays a role and we might not even know it.
Exactly. And just as you said, so many of these stories in Asian Pacific Islander families and Asian Pacific Islander cultures, we're told not to talk about the bad times, not to talk about the challenges. And yet, if we don't share about them, if we don't talk about them, then we don't really have the opportunity to really learn the full journey of what folks have experienced, and to learn from the hardships as well as the resiliencies that our families and our communities have had. And so I just want to say thank you again, Jackie, for joining us tonight and for sharing your family's story. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next storyteller is Angela. And so Angela is of Micronesian heritage. Her family migrated to the US in the 1970s. She currently lives in Michigan. And one thing that she wants you to know about her is that she loves to read young adult books. So everyone, let's welcome Angela.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Ed. As Ed said, I'm Angela Edward. I'm here in Michigan. I identify as Micronesian American. My family has been slowly coming to the States since the 1970s. And I was born here in the US and I was raised here in the US. So I consider myself a child of the diaspora. Like a lot of children who grow up in immigrant families, a lot of our values, even though our family is no longer, wherever homeland may be for each of us, our family's no longer there. Our values often come over to the US with our families. And so for me, one of the big things, like a lot of people of the global majority growing up, that was honored was that we really not only respected our elders, but we honored them. Everything they said was important. They were the ones that you had to listen to. They were a pillar to the community. I think I've carried that a long way with me. Even to this day, I work with the geriatric community and I love my job. I think a piece of that is just that I've really carried that with me a long way. But I always think about a specific memory that happened when I was growing up. My family lived in the Ozarks, so in Southwest Missouri. And in the summer, there was a very specific spot that we would go and we would swim almost every single weekend. It was called Indian Creek. And just to be completely frank, there was just this thing that happened a lot of the time when Micronesians were out in public congregating as groups where people would call the police on us. And then the police would come and there was always some reason that we had to leave or we couldn't congregate in the area. So I do remember being at Indian Creek and there was a certain weekend that the police did show up and they had told us that we were not allowed to park on the road in front of the creek, even though we did it every weekend. A lot of people did it every weekend. And I remember all of us not really understanding like why this was or if this was new. And when the police came, there was a group of older men in the Micronesian community who were talking to them, and they kept trying to explain to them, like, we come here every weekend, we don't understand, can you tell us, like, is there a law? And the police, I could see them just getting more and more impatient and getting more frustrated and getting angry with the gentlemen who were speaking to them. And at one point, while they were having a discussion, I saw on the side of the road, there was an actual sign. It was kind of on a cliff and you could see it. And it said, cars are to park on this side of the road. And so I remember I walked up to the police officer and I said, hi, I was just wondering, there's a sign that says you can park on that side of the road. So if I can tell everybody to move their car to that side of the road, can we park there? And the police officer, he kind of like talked to me a little bit. And then he was like, you know what? Yeah, if you tell everybody to move their car, you can all park there. You can stay at the creek. It's not that big of a deal. So I went and I told everybody, they said we can stay, we have to move our cars, and everybody moved their cars and we were able to stay. And I just remember all of my family and all my friends just being like, oh my goodness, thank you so much for talking to them. We appreciate you. And I always think of that memory because for me, that was like one of my first memories that I recall feeling like in my community, which is Micronesian, we honor people who are older than us, and the older men we're talking, the police officers, because that's important. But in America, we more so honor people who we think are similar to us. And I have a very Midwestern accent. And so the gentlemen, the police officers that we're talking to also have Midwestern accents. And I think there's no part of me that does not believe that I was more accepted than the elders in that situation, simply because I come off as more American. And so it, at first, not just at first, for a while, that was something that really, like, it should have made me feel good that I was able to help, but it kind of haunted me. It made me feel guilty that there were people in my community that were not respected the way I felt they should be respected. But then I think at some point I kind of flipped that narrative in my head and I was like, you know what, this is my blessing, because in a lot of ways, I've always straddled these two communities of being Micronesian and being American, and feeling like I'm never Micronesian enough, I'm never American enough. And I just remember feeling like maybe this is my superpower. Maybe I'm just Micronesian enough and just American enough to figure out ways to make sure that people aren't falling through the margins in our community, and make sure that things are advocated for, because I do have a voice that for whatever reason people want to listen to just because it sounds more American. And so something that I thought was so ugly at first, I think I've been able to kind of recreate that narrative in my head. But I do also think that it is part of the reason that in the long run, I've become a social worker, which is what I do now. And a lot of what I do every day is advocating for people and trying to make sure that people don't fall through the cracks. And I think that a huge part of that is just that growing up the way that I did, sometimes that was just what I had to do. And so if there's anything that I can share with whoever's listening today, that maybe they can take with them, is that if there's any folks who are like me, who grew up in the US and kind of always feel like they're kind of not fitting in either community, don't always look at it as a bad thing, but maybe think of it as more of a superpower. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Angela, for sharing that story. I'm sure that it was nerve-wracking to go through while you were living it, but I love your message of how living in two worlds doesn't necessarily have to be a weakness or a way of making someone feel different, but it can actually, like you said, be a superpower. What I wanted to ask you is this question is, we are hoping that there'll be people watching tonight or watching the recording of this program who might consider joining us for a storytelling event in the future and telling their own stories. What might you want to share with everyone about why they should do it?
Oh, that's a really good question, Ed. I think the thing I would tell people is storytelling, getting more involved in storytelling, trying to learn more skills around it is a really great skill in a lot of ways. I think, like, even for me, when you go into interviews, what's the first thing they ask you? They say, tell us a little bit about yourself before they even get into the questions. And I really do believe that storytelling can help you not just in sharing these things between family members in intimate ways, but it can help you in terms of just transferring it into lots of skills and spaces that helps people connect with you in a better way. So I think that if you like connecting with people, it's such a great thing to get involved in.
Wonderful words of wisdom, Angela. Thank you again for joining us tonight as a storyteller.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. So our final storyteller tonight is Bonnie. Bonnie is a second-generation immigrant of Korean heritage. Her family migrated to the US in 1980, and she currently lives in the Bay Area. One thing she wants you to know about her is that she lives in a raucous intergenerational home with her mother who just turned 70, her brother who's a fancy bartender, her husband, her 2 sons, and her dog. So everyone, welcome Bonnie.
Hi, Ed. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for hosting this opportunity to practice a little storytelling. It's the fall of 2020, month 7 of the pandemic. I wake up like most days with my 4-year-old surprisingly heavy limbs resting on my hip. My jaws are pretty sore from yet another night of grinding my teeth from worry and, dare I say, dread. We're frankly all tired of each other. I throw on a nice shirt, shuffle downstairs, still wearing my pajama pants, past my mom's room and into our makeshift office for a series of Zoom calls. Emerging 6 hours later and back upstairs, I find my kids, my mom, and my brother, who's agreed to leave a job that he loves to minimize exposure risk to my mom. They're hungrily unwrapping a square box with faded images that, while being in color, are all yellow. The corners have exposed brown cardboard layers, but the kids lift out from this box a shiny chrome pasta maker. And I'm immediately transported to a memory that begins when I'm in utero. It's 1980, the middle of the night. My mom's 28, 5 months pregnant with me, and standing at the Amtrak station in Tucson, Arizona. She arrived there by way of Los Angeles, packed away in her single large bag are precious supplies of Korean chili flakes, doenjang, a Korean miso, soy sauce, and rice. She's packed them and carried them from her home in Seoul. She figures that these 4 ingredients will carry her over for a little while. Shortly thereafter, she finds herself intensely craving noodles. It's unclear whether it's pregnancy cravings or just a longing for home or both. So she goes to the American grocery store. She gravitates to the pasta aisle and her eyes scan up and down, side to side. There are so many mysterious types of noodles. Yet she doesn't have any extra money to make an experimental purchase. Lost, she wanders to the baking aisle and finds that flour is plentiful and inexpensive. So she gulps, purchases the flour, and soon spends more than a week's household budget on an Italian pasta maker. Then she starts producing, for years to come, prodigious amounts of noodles. She perfects a recipe for dak kalguksu. She starts the broth a day before, slowly simmering a chicken, skimming multiple layers of fat that bubble to the top, expertly removes the breast meat and the thigh meat as they are cooked and saves it later to shred. On the second day, she uses the plentiful flour to make a simple dough, and after letting it sit, she uses the pasta maker to cut wide noodles. The bones stay in until the very end to be strained away. Then onions, garlic, and large amounts of squash are added to the broth, noodles cooked and topped with yangnyeom-jang, a spicy soy sauce. Though every bowl of noodles doesn't lessen her longing for home, bowl by bowl, she feels more connected to the family she's growing in America. After many years, Asian grocery stores began to open in Tucson, and the pasta maker falls into disuse, but it persists in the growing arsenal of kitchen gadgets and pantry items that my mom stocks to recreate home. And 30 years later, the pasta maker makes an interstate move to California when my mom comes to live with us. And not too many years after her move, I see my then 4 and 7-year-old eyes glitter with excitement as they mix flour with water, crack eggs, knead the dough. Then they feed the dough through the pasta maker, taking turns cranking it. They're covered with flour, bits of dough in their hair. They fight over who's going to crank the handle and for how long. But for the most part, they're getting along because they're really aligned on this mission to make the perfect egg pasta, this time with a simple Italian marinara sauce. My brother, with expert precision, coaches the kids, even though the pasta maker is new to him. It's because by the time he was born, 6 years after me, the pasta maker was already sitting in the back of the pantry. I see my mom delighted. She mouthed, "I told you so." She's referring back to the lively debate we had about my desire to donate her kitchen arsenal when we combined households. This snapshot makes me remember how our world became very small during the pandemic, but in so many ways, the pasta maker allowed us to go deeper into our conversations, into our family history, into our ability to create together. And it gave us the ability to build a deeper connection to home and each other. And as my children like to say, most importantly, more committed to what we consider the universal love of noodles. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. And this was completely unplanned, folks, for us to start tonight with food and for Bonnie to end with a story about food. Bonnie, I want to ask first, how was that for you? This is another opportunity that you've now had to share a different story about your family.
Yeah, it was really fun. And that's what I needed. I wanted like a little bit of lightheartedness because things, even this year, it's already felt like there's been a lot of pain and, across in particular Asian American communities. And so, yeah, I was looking for something that I could share that for me is a very like joyful memory.
Thank you for saying that. And that really is one of the things about these story share events is that you get to share whatever story you want. And there's so many stories that we and each of our families have inside of us. So whether it's a story of food, whether it's a story of hardship, whether it's a story of a challenge, an opportunity to actually lean into a new superpower that we might have, these story shares will be an opportunity for everyone to take a moment to think about what's the story that they want to share with the world and why. Bonnie, another quick question is, what advice or encouragement might you have for anyone who might be interested in potentially becoming a storyteller on one of these future programs?
Oh, gosh. I don't know about advice necessarily, but I think something that's really powerful about telling stories is that I think we tap into this stream of generational wisdom. And I really do believe by telling stories, in particular ones that have caused pain, whether in our lives or in our ancestors' lives, that we contribute to healing, both for us and then like both cascading up and then cascading down.
Well said, well said. So everyone, let's show some appreciation for Bonnie, for Jackie, for Angela by showing your hearts in the reactions, by typing some comments of affirmation into the chat box. I know for me, one of the things that I've always appreciated about these story shares is that for those of us who tell these stories, in many ways, they're an opportunity for us to celebrate and to honor our ancestors, especially when we're talking about stories of our parents or our grandparents and what they experienced. They're also an opportunity for us to lift up and perhaps do a little bit of healing of our own. Sometimes as immigrants, we experience hardship, we experience racism, we experience xenophobia, but we suffer in silence. And so by taking that opportunity to just peel back the layers of the onion a little bit and take a moment to step into our courage, to step into our genuineness, to step into our authenticity, because we're not a model minority, right? We can't always be happy. We can't always be successful. And it's through these experiences of both hardship as well as joy that we have the opportunity to fully live our lives. So let me just double check to see if there's anyone who would like to just share some personal reflections after hearing these stories or some appreciations for storytellers. Not seeing any hands raised, but I'm seeing a lot of encouraging words in chat. And so that's great. What we'll do is we'll go ahead and move towards ending tonight's program. But before we do, if you enjoyed tonight's stories and you are so inspired to share your own story, we will be offering a free storytelling training in March. And what you can do is you can click on the link in the chat box that's being typed in right now, and that'll take you to a survey to provide us some feedback on tonight's program. And there'll also be a question in that survey where you can indicate your interest in potentially participating in this free training. We're so happy to be able to provide tonight's program, as well as our future storytelling training and future events, free of charge. So if you enjoyed this program and you would like to make a donation to support the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation, please feel free to visit our website to make a contribution. And you can do that at www.aiisf.org/donate. So with that, let me just say a heartfelt thank you again to Jackie, to Angela, and to Bonnie, and to all of you for tuning in and being part of our community of storytelling and story sharing. We hope you'll join us for future events. We actually have another event that's taking place a week from this Saturday on Angel Island that is going to feature a Black poet as well as a Chinese poet. And the event will feature both of their poetries in celebration of communities coming together for Black History Month, as well as Chinese Lunar New Year. So with that, thank you everyone for tuning in, and we hope to see you at a future event or out on Angel Island. Thank you. Have a great night.